Do we want to, maybe want to wait a couple of minutes? So I don't see Saad yet, and he was one of our. Yeah.
I think it's fun.
Yeah. Let's give it a few minutes.
It's a Friday and it's 8 a.m. on the West Coast, so we'll cut some people some slack.
Yeah. So for this benefits of the recording, at least, this is the Container Identity Working Group for September 8th, 2017. I'm just waiting on people to show up.
Hey guys.
Actually, could I get a volunteer note taker, maybe? So I think anyone on the working group mailing list should have edit on the agenda doc. It would be great if someone could take notes as we're going. If you don't have access, you can drop your email in the chat, and I'll give you edit access on the doc.
Yeah, I don't mind. I can take notes.
Great, thanks.
So, Greg, before we dive into the details, can we revisit some of our goals of this container identity working group? Because from the goals, it looks like we focus on we mentioned that two times about single container pods. So, what is our goal about multiple container pods? So, are we trying to solve that, or we just kind of avoid that? I'm not sure what's our goal about this working group.
I don't think we. Let me look at the goals.
My bias while Greg was looking at it is like, I don't think that, so we've had a long discussion about whether containers or pods are primary in Kubernetes, and pods are what are primary. So there's things that we don't allow to be done per container. And I think there'll always be a tension there, but I think we're talking about pod identity and how it translates to containers. Even though the working group is container identity, that's mostly because that's what people think about when they think about running containers and all that. But at the heart of it, I would say my bias would be to say we are going to come up with a pod identity that containers can use, and that subdividing identity within the pod to containers is something that in other areas we have pushed back on pretty strongly. And so, there might be a bar there that we'd have to come up with a really good reason to support.
Okay. Just curious, who is this speaking? Because this is sig-auth lead.
This is Clayton Coleman.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think. I definitely don't think we should build an identity system that only works when you have one container in a pod, because that would not be good. So yeah, I think Clayton's right. So in that doc, I did come up I was trying to think of this situation where, do we need container identity as well as pod identity? And I tried to come up with, so if you look under the use cases, I tried to come up with some where you need separate identities per container inside a pod. I think those are probably valid, and I think people will probably want to have some sort of boundary there, but I don't think it's. Yeah, I'm not 100% on that, on whether those use cases are you know, are strong enough to say, yes, we definitely need container identity.
And
in my mind, they're all sort of nice to have. All the cases I can think of, it's nice to have separation, but it wouldn't be a deal breaker if
Right.
Yeah, and we definitely have said in Kubernetes, like originally there was a discussion about not allowing containers to have separate users or separate security domains. And the reason is that it's a small percentage use case. However, I think there have been enough people over time that have wanted some level of isolation per pod to separate out, for instance, a logging agent, which doesn't need privileges, from a web serving component that does need access to the network, et cetera. It seems likely that whatever we would do, the container identity is a child of the pod identity.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I think the pod identity has to be the primary thing.
I have one other scope question, which is our goal to allow pods to use identities that sort of exist outside of the pod itself, like service accounts, or this thing that we define, and the service account still exists even if no pods exist that actually run with the service account? Or are we also having a goal for pods to be able to assert, I am this pod from Kubernetes. This is the ID that was given to me by Kubernetes. And that, sort of is the identity of the pod, even if it's not sort of grabbing an additional identity that exists outside of it.
I think the discussion that resonated most with me was about the service account being kind of the logical identity, but not being a single credential that's shared between the pods. So the pod or the container gets a credential that establishes that identity, but pods don't necessarily share the same credential.
Okay. So they don't share credentials, but they would share the identity of a service account.
I think so. And then we talk about use cases where you might want like a pod identity. I don't know. To me, almost all use cases are covered by sort of the service account semantics right now. The only important thing right now is that the credential for the service account is also kind of shared.
There have been requests too to hang other identities off of pods, and I think like one of them would be like service identity. So like all of the pods that form part of a logical service might be part of multiple services. So there's like a one-to-many versus one-to-one relationship that we have there. And service accounts themselves, people have definitely, we've gotten this request a lot of being able to tie a service account identity to something in LDAP, as an example, because a lot of like large organizations that already have some sort of formal structure for identity usually have something like service accounts. The reason Kube has service accounts is because the problem is that when people want to lock those down, you can't easily take applications and redeploy them. So like, somebody who wants to have a very limited environment for identity wants to take away flexibility, but the vast majority of people really just want to be able to say, I want to be able to take an app that somebody else gave me, like a Helm chart, and deploy it, and it's in a limited scope, and I don't need to go talk to anybody else to go deploy it. What I do need to do is talk to someone else to get that hooked up so that other parts of the system recognize, namespace, DAS, service account, workflow as part of, on cluster A as a real user in LDAP. That link, we haven't really scoped out, but I do think it's in scope for this work, or to at least discuss how that could be associated. Because the reason people want pod identity is so pods can go talk to stuff. And if that stuff is also talking to LDAP, you have no other option.
Yeah, I think the service account case covers the case where you're talking about a client identity pretty well, because that's the use case for service accounts. The other kind of identity you talked about where you want to give an identity to all the pods behind a service is like the server identity. And service accounts don't necessarily cover that right now. Like you could make it work, but you'd have to be careful about lining up exactly which pods had that service account and which ones were back in service, and like align those things manually, or you would have sort of mismatched service.
And ideally, like the Istio stuff and other people have built, like the Spiffy integrations, inject TLS certificates. A TLS certificate and key is an identity. And it should be, I think this working group should at least describe how those kinds of additional identities can be easily injected and used in a way that makes sense with the other things that go on and get added. Like I think we don't want to ever take use cases away. We want to make use cases easy, streamlined.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. So I think like projects like Istio that are like solving the service to service kind of problem, we should basically enable them. So we should enable them to like be able to provision that identity. And just on the kind of like, does the pod assert its own identity? I agree with kind of what everyone else said, but one kind of like thing to think about when you think about pod identity is when you create a deployment. If I create an Nginx deployment, all the pods in that deployment get kind of random names. So it's like if we kind of tied identity to like the actual pod itself, it would be kind of hard to reason about, like in an access in an authorization sense, like how do I authorize like all the Nginx things in this deployment when, you know, like they have like kind of random names at the pod level. So it'll be Nginx-1234 or something.
I think it's not useful for authorization, but it could be useful for auditing.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So I think there's maybe a use case for, you know, if the service account level identity is for your deployment as a whole, sort of, but the credentials for that identity that are handed up per pod still include some metadata about the actual pod it belongs to, so that you can have that audit trail.
Yeah, and potentially information about the node too that it's running on. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some debate about the putting extra stuff into the certificate. Primarily, what we do in Istio is we put the service account into the certificate, and do the mapping. Is we have some discovery service to map from a service account to service name. That's how Istio does now.
So we have an agenda. So the first thing was kind of, unless we want to, we can take more kind of like high-level scope questions. Those are probably good to get out.
I definitely didn't mean to derail the agenda. But
No. I think this is a good discussion and useful.
I think Saad is here, so.
Yeah, Saad is now here.
We successfully delayed until Saad showed up.
Yep, I'm here.
So, does someone want to have maybe Clayton? Does someone want to have a crack at kind of describing this high-level kind of initializer plus FlexVolume idea? So the kind of thing we got to last meeting was we kind of had like this high-level idea, but we thought we probably needed some storage expertise. So Saad's our Google storage TL for Kubernetes. So we thought it'd be good to have him come and have someone who knows kind of FlexVolumes more than we do to talk about sort of feasibility of that. So maybe Clayton, can you give it a...
Sure. So, so for a while, there's kind of been, the kubelet really doesn't have an extension point, right? So you can either specify something with a pod, and then you have to inject everything via the control plane. So you want to add a secret to Kubernetes today, you create a secret, and then you reference it in your pod, and the control plane has your secret, and then the node gets your secret by talking to the control plane. And there's been this long-running arc in Kubernetes where we've been talking about extension points. We want to make Kubernetes extensible. Use cases that require things that we'll never add to the core Kubernetes, we want to still be possible. And so like the API servers have extensions for adding APIs, and they have extensions now for adding admission control, which lets you do policy so that you can say, you know, this can't happen on the cluster. Kind of the corollary to that, FlexVolumes were actually one of our first extension points. One of the things that we were discussing as we started to snowball some of these ideas for people trying to do integrations like this was, if I am a cluster administrator and I want to enable a capability for pod authors on the node that doesn't go through the control plane. So in a model where a node, like secrets are a great example of something where not everybody wants to put all of their mission critical secrets inside Kubernetes for very good reasons. We talk about things like Vault and Kerberos, and some of these, the security model for those is very much something on the node trust running as root, trust something else on the node running as root to tell it what it should do. Those sorts of things need to surface stuff into pods. And so we started this discussion about, well, how would we, across a cluster, allow users to request a capability or request injection of something into a pod in an API kind of way through the pod definition that allows an integrator to, on each node, have a kind of hook point into the pod. And so flex volumes were a natural one. And so there have been a couple of discussions. I think Saad, when we talked about the Rook stuff, I think we brought this up a little bit. And I mentioned this to Tim a couple of times as well. Even though we know that flex volumes in theory are going to be replaced by CSI, it seems like in general, it's very reasonable to say we need a way of extending what happens on a node so that privileged agents on the node can also participate in the pod lifecycle by providing things to pods that ask for them as necessary.
Clayton, you mentioned about CSR. So is that certificate sign request?
CSI, sorry, the container storage interface, which is the intended replacement of FlexVolume. And so we did put some work in place on the sig-auth side to allow pod security policy to control what flex volumes you have access to, because pod security policy is also how we control whether you have access to direct volume mounting, whether you have access to host volumes. We've added 2 new features, whether you can access a host path, a specific host path by path, and that's basically modeled through the sig-auth RBAC flow mostly. You say service account X or user X has access to a pod security policy that allows it to access host paths under var custom foo myapp1. And so we've kind of taken some of the steps on here, but I think it's a good discussion to have. And Saad, this is kind of where I hand it off to you, which would be, if we wanted to enable an extension point that pods could request things on the nodes, can you talk a little about where you see FlexVolume and CSI going in this angle?
Yeah, so I think originally the plan was that CSI would replace Flex, but we've started to notice that since CSI is so far out and we desperately needed something that was a out-of-tree mechanism to do volume plugins, Flex has kind of become that de facto. So the plan going forward is that we will maintain Flex indefinitely, and CSI will come along as another volume plugin. It's not going to replace Flex. We have people like Rook who are actually developing Flex volume plugins, so it's critical for us not to break the API as we move forward. Our goal is to try to add in more end-to-end testing and things like that to make sure that the Flex API remains stable and doesn't have any regressions moving forward. So you could rest assured using Flex, you're not going to be on shaky legs. That'll be fine. The next question is how you're going to use it. So Flex and CSI were both designed with the assumption that the backing medium is a remote directory or a remote file system or a remote block device. And the reason that's important is management of so the way it sounds like we want to use this for identity is basically the way that we would use empty dir, which is create an empty dir, which takes some scratch space from the local host, pre-populate it with some data, and then make that available to a container. You can emulate that with CSI or with Flex, because basically what Flex and CSI do is, here is a target mount path. I expect your data to be available there. What we expect you to do is bind mount or somehow make available your remote data there. What you could do is just use that, create a directory there and put your contents there. Problem with that is we don't take that into account as local storage. So it doesn't get accounted for in things like the ephemeral storage capacity isolation and things like that. With identity, I think the way you guys are planning on using it, it's not going to be a massive amount of data to begin with, so it would be okay. But the tweaks that I think we may need to consider on our side is basically the ability to mark a volume as ephemeral and let end users use it as an ephemeral volume, and just make sure that we're accounting for it as such.
Another thing too, Saad, would be memory backed versus non-memory backed.
Yeah. Basically, the whole empty dir needs to be recreated outside of.
And so there was one more that I don't know that is like a hard requirement, but I think would be very useful. It's the kind of the classic, people want to be able to mount in single files, because a lot of the UNIX file system is single volume mounted. And so there was some question, like, I know this is like a huge problem with like config maps and secrets for a lot of people who want to inject a single file in a directory but not clobber the directory. I could imagine somewhere in a release or two someone saying, well, this is all great, but I need to inject, and like I'm just making up an example here, Etsy curb5 key tab without clobbering the contents of the directory. And that's one where I know that we're a little bit further out, but also fits.
Could we use host path in that case if the direct file already exists?
In this case, we'd be creating a file, and then we want to host path it. So we might.
Got it.
I think a lot of I think the FlexVolume cases that I've heard of are things like, I have Vault as an agent running on a node. Vault wants to, the local plugin would glue to either a local or remote Vault and say, I'm this node, I'm trying to get this secret for this pod. And like I'm using Vault because like this is something that has been discussed from various people on the Vault side. Vault then says, okay, we'll double check that pod's on that node, and that there's an RBAC check or whatever. We trust that, or an admin has pre-configured it, deliver the secrets back, and then whatever that secret is just gets put on the file system. The almost flip side of that might be something like a Fuse directory that is managed by like more classic Linux level security integrations, where there's lots of mechanisms for this already that people are using for Kerberos and encrypted file systems that are mounted, etc. Some of those would be like, okay, well, I've got a Fuse daemon, I need to mount the Fuse file system. That sounds a little bit more like maybe more of a classic volume, because it really is a file system. It just happens to be one that we don't randomly give out to people. There has to be some mapping between who and what.
There's another use case too that's maybe a little different, where your credential provider wants to actually expose an API through something like a Unix domain socket. So we have this use case we've been talking about with Istio and Spiffy for the Handshake API, where you want to basically give a piece of code access to an API that lets them do TLS handshakes without giving them a private key.
Yeah, and I don't know if they're on the call. Dimitri and some folks on Dimitri's team had done some, there was a project called Custodia, which was mounting a Unix daemon socket into containers, and there's a protocol for going and getting certs. And that was something that they've been working on for a while. But I think a lot of it's the same kind of use case of, we don't know exactly what you want to inject. The nice thing about auth in Linux is that there's a billion solutions, and everybody has explored every possible part of the solution space. So some of it would be like, can we find a mechanism that's reasonably generic and understand how to communicate SOD with FlexVolume to be like, if we needed this, how would we work together to make that happen? If we wanted to do this, is this something FlexVolumes would never do, etc.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. It hasn't been in the scope of what we have planned for Flex or CSI, but I can imagine that becoming more of a requirement to support ephemeral volumes.
Yeah, can you elaborate a little bit on just what ephemeral means in this context?
So an ephemeral volume is a volume whose life cycle is tied to the pod. So a classic example of that is the empty dir. When an empty dir is created, we create scratch space donated from the host whether backed by the physical disk or memory, doesn't matter. And then we make that available to all the containers in the pod. They can write whatever they want into it, and then when the pod is terminated, we'll go ahead and delete it. So far, as of 1.7, we haven't had really any way to be able to put limits on how much storage users can use, which is really bad because they can go ahead and just take all the disk space available on a particular host, and that's bad. So we're working on being able to add ephemeral storage limits and quotas. That's work in progress. That went into 1.8 as alpha. And so with Flex, when we planned both Flex and CSI, we were thinking more about the remote use case rather than ephemeral, or more the persistent use case. So that doesn't mean that it's not possible. Even today, you could use Flex as you described by just, instead of actually mounting a remote directory, populating the directory that gets passed in on the mount call with whatever contents that you want. That'll get you what you want. The only drawback is that any storage space that you use in that directory won't be accounted for. So that's something that we should consider in the future. And like Clayton said, the assumption is that you have a directory that's being mounted in, and there's possibly use cases for being more fine-grained and having a particular subdirectory. Actually, we have the subpath. I wonder if we could reuse that mechanism.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, it's like, I think we're like really close, but we just keep like, it's like we want to figure out how to get all of our, we want to get all the features like auto updating. Because I think like a common thing for identity is the container identity may not change, or we might make the argument that we want to force the pod to be recreated before it gets its identity refreshed. But for like other types of systems, if it's a vault token, that vault token's lifecycle might be shorter than the pod. And so, it needs to be updatable, which is something that we have with, secrets.
Yeah.
But we also probably want it to be read-only. I think we might be able to get around the limiting aspect by just saying the admin and integrator who build these sorts of integrations, they most of the time are probably going to want read-only, but they definitely can probably say, like, it's up to you not to exceed your disk space. And if we can keep that small enough, I think like that's, I'm trying to think of a writable file system that most identity, secret, or bi-directional communications would be large on. They'd probably be fairly small for the most part. And like we could control by a quota how many, for instance, flex volumes you can add. We can control via quota or pod security policy whether you could even add a flex volume. We could control via initializers or external admission checks special parameter, like, an example of what we can do now with external admission is, an administrator could install a flex volume, and you could say, hey, this flex volume has all these parameters that can do these crazy powerful things. We should be in a pretty good state where at the time of creation of that pod, you can check via an external webhook whether those parameters are allowed for the particular namespace, cluster, service account user doing it. So like some of this is like, this might actually be a really good place for us to try and bring all of our extension mechanisms together and make examples that really show how this ties to this, ties to this, ties to this, and suddenly you have a secure system, and we've got all these things lined up and they all work well together.
Yeah,
I had one question about kind of like technical detail here, but if you have a flex volume provider that is implementing one of these auth token schemes, let's say like Vault, that component is like a privileged component in your system. It has some credential that it needs to use to talk to Vault to get credentials for workloads. What's the recommended way to sort of, the way the Flex Volume interface works, you get called as a new process sort of for each API call. What's the expected way that process can get credentials?
Yeah, we actually ran into this very recently with somebody who was trying to implement Rook. And our suggestion there was for them to just run their process inside of a pod, deploy that as a daemon set onto all the machines. Then they can populate the pod with whatever credentials they need, service accounts, etc., and make sure that the pod itself has access and it remains up and running and it's managed by Kubernetes. And then the pod would have a UNIX domain socket, which it drops onto the host machine with a host path. And the FlexVolume would basically just act as a dumb adapter. It would proxy calls between kubelet into this pod, and then the pod would have everything that it needs to be able to handle.
That makes sense. So you're using basically the Unix access control to that domain socket as the credential.
Yes.
And Simo had a point too, that identity on Unix domain sockets, you definitely want to get both sides. There's additional information around that, like Linux isn't aware of, UID, PID, GID, but there's additional info that applies, such as like what C group you're in, or ultimately your pod identity. And it's possible that the FlexVolume provider can act as some of that bridge, but we would want to go figure out, like, can FlexVolumes correctly and accurately represent the identity to both sides? And if it's going to go do that, well, how does it know what the pod identity is? It probably doesn't want to give the private key of the pod to the FlexVolume. But for instance, there might be something where we want to actually get an assertion, like as another use case for I want to give somebody else something that proves that they are this pod or this container, and have it make that easy to validate at the node level.
I wonder if we could build a lot of these use cases into CSI, since CSI is kind of in design right now. We haven't had it in scope, but we're early enough that we can make those tweaks.
It is interesting because, like, the idea of a memory-backed directory that has a single credential on it that is exposed via an HSM is not so far from a fuse provider that provides an identity that comes from an HSM, and that's not so far from a fuse provider providing arbitrary remote storage, which isn't that different from a kernel driver providing a block file system. Like, it definitely seems like, and I don't want to, like, I feel like there's some level of how do we get these use cases and make a clear decision in CSI whether they're covered or not early, so that we can say, okay, do we need a second mechanism?
Yeah.
Saad, what would be the best way for folks in this working group to get engaged with that?
I'm going to send out to the storage-sig design for CSI. I can make sure to send that out to sig-auth as well. And then that can be the catalyst for discussion, and anybody who's super interested can start jumping into storage-sig discussions.
Okay, and maybe, like, folks on this call who want to get involved in that, add yourself to the agenda in that interest list, and maybe we can deputize folks to be the runners or communicators between the two SIGs. I mean, I know a lot of people have a lot of stuff to do, but having someone on this SIG who can kind of participate with Saad and report back, or several people, and would be really good.
Having a pod to which FlexVolumes would proxy to. And if we go with that solution, actually, then you don't need to worry about the stealing disk space from the local host, because the backing medium could be an empty dir inside the pod itself, which is managed by Kubernetes.
And with initializers, we certainly a flex. If there was even some way where maybe like every FlexVolume gets an empty dir or something like that, would be interesting as well.
Yeah.
I guess with the daemon set, you have like a bit of a race condition there for identity to be available, right?
Your daemon set would have to be running.
Yeah.
Well, and if the interesting thing is that what identities does the daemon set need? And you could argue that a lot of the core system services, like kube proxy is a good example of this.
Actually, for a race, like if the daemon set that was servicing the FlexVolume on that kubelet wasn't running, then the pod would fail during the volume setup phase and would go into its retry loop. So I don't think it does race.
Yeah.
And I was thinking more about like booting up the system, right? Like I install a kube cluster and then I install custom identity provider X that runs as a daemon set. It may not need a pod identity, but once it's up, it can service that. There's definitely some things that we should talk about, like and their impacts on bootstrapping and how that might apply to cluster lifecycle. I mean,
I think it's reasonable that daemon set might not get its identity from the Kubernetes control plane. It might get its identity by bootstrapping through some out-of-band attestation that proves that it's on a node or something like that.
Yeah. And again, like it's not even, like in a lot of the more traditional security environments, there's already going to be some agent running on these nodes managed by other IT processes. And so there's kind of going to be that spectrum of, if you've already got this set up, your provider is probably going to just talk to the local daemon, and someone will have pre-configured that daemon to trust, whatever this new process is coming up, or it's managed out of band. There's nothing that prevents a FlexVolume from already being installed on the node, or CSI already being installed on the node, in the sense of like we could probably work towards that. But like from a security perspective too, a lot of the spiffy work is very focused on that chain of attestation from cloud to machine to process. Kerberos is the same way. We should probably make sure that anything that we do here, we take those best practices into mind and like try to gather that information from the people who have the expertise in those domains to make sure we don't create the wrong sort of, the master is authorized to do this, but we actually wanted the node to be the only one who's allowed to do this. And the masters can lie, but the nodes ultimately have the final say on whether they trust a workload that comes onto them or something.
Well, Istio is moving to that direction as well. And I mean, the node agent identity things. So I just want to know if the node agent identity is a kind of a scope of this working group, or we just focus on the pod identity.
Node identity is definitely within scope of sig-auth at least. So I would imagine that this working group would be interested in how the stuff we're talking about over there interacts with whatever proposed container identity format we go with.
And certainly people like Mike Denise and others from SIG Cluster Lifecycle who've been handling the node identity and node agent identity sides are going to participate here. We should definitely make sure to broadcast this out. That actually reminds me, Greg, we probably actually want to do a Cube community update and say like we've had our first couple. It'd be a good time to queue up some calls for others to participate.
Yeah, like how do you want to do that? Like what sort of community at the community meeting or?
At the community meeting, like, hey, this is what we've come up in the first three. There's some topics we've had, and then now we're starting to talk about, we kind of think we're going to talk about these topics, and we're starting to refine our scope. Other people in the community who are interested, be aware that these discussions are happening here, and either involve or just let us know if there's a trade-off, like kind of being that, actively and aggressively communicating helps to kind of, get the right people to see, even if we don't actually go implement anything.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Hey, Greg, so a couple weeks ago, we had a discussion with Vault. I think Mike Denise was on that call, and they decided not to go down the FlexVolume path. Do you remember what the reason was?
Yeah, so we had this discussion with Vault. My phone has just decided to interrupt me. Sorry. Yeah, we had this discussion with Vault. So they were considering the FlexVolume thing, and what they are actually working on now is, so we kind of discussed the two kind of trade-offs of like, so the FlexVolume is kind of like pulling the trust out of Vault. So you would like use the FlexVolume to provision this this Vault token to the workload essentially. So you kind of like take the trust out of Vault. And so then we put to them kind of like the opposite of like pushing the Kubernetes trust into Vault. And so they started looking at that, and it seemed like a better option for them at the moment. So I think basically now their plan is that they're working on a authentication backend for Kubernetes service account JOTs. So the idea is that you could, create a service account that represents kind of create a service account and give it to the pods that need that whatever secret you're trying to hand out with Vault, and then you would have a either the application knows about Vault and can just use the Kubernetes service account directly to talk to Vault, or you have something on the like a daemon set that does that bit for the application, and then talks to Vault with the Kubernetes service account, and then puts whatever secret that you're retrieving kind of into the right place where the application is expecting it. So I think like that kind of worked for Vault because they already had the notion of pluggable backends, pluggable authentication backends. But I'm not like that. I don't see that as kind of like a general solution. I don't think everybody's going to be able to like.
Yeah, that's almost on like the high touch side of integration, which is you want to build a deep integration, and I think there will be more of those over time too. It's kind of like the what was the example I was going to use? The people grow up the spectrum, and some people start off at different points. FlexVolume is like. We talk about initializers and like pod presets. We say pod presets are like a pod preset would be like the simplest possible initializer that does like the 80% use case. But when you want to move up to that next level, you're going to need something more powerful. That's where initializers come in. And then you move up the spectrum one more step. And that's when you get into things like external admission with mutation, where there's no other way to accomplish it and to get the characteristics you want. We may end up with that for security integrations is here, like very reasonably. Like you can replace identity at several levels, depending on what your trade-offs are.
Greg, that use case with basically teaching an external system to understand the Kubernetes identity, and then at the same time too, changing the Kubernetes service account identity so that it's not just a bearer token that can be verified by a party and can't be replayed. That was the exact same thing I was going to talk about, have on the agenda about Helm and Tiller in the Kubernetes dashboard.
Let's do it. That's a good segue then.
Yeah, that's a good segue. Okay, so if Helm Tiller there, Tiller is the server that runs in the cluster. It runs with root access. Helm CLI runs as a cluster user, maybe an administrator or maybe not.
Helm CLI doesn't have any Kubernetes credentials, right? It just has credentials to talk to Tiller.
Yeah. So, and the dash, yes, okay. So this is kind of the problem right now has its own kind of credential system. The dashboard is similar. So really, you want to take the dashboard, you want to give access to a bunch of Kubernetes users. You already have an identity system that's backing your cluster somehow, whether that's OIDC backend or your own whatever auth backend you have. It'd be great if you could take your Kubernetes user identity and be able to hand it to the dashboard or hand it to Tiller and have that be able to authenticate you, authorize you according to like whatever app-specific authorization policy that thing has, and then impersonate you to the Kubernetes API.
So I had some comments about this out of the last meeting. I assume we're just going to go on to this next item then, unless anybody has other comments. So basically, I know that for Tectonic, our console, and I think OpenShift's console as well, doesn't have this problem. We both are using OAuth flows to grant our dashboard equivalents sort of credentials on behalf of particular users. That works really well for us. So we are building against the OIDC endpoints. I think OpenShift is doing something slightly different. But basically, we're using the pluggable authentication mechanisms built into Kubernetes. My main concern with sort of this effort or one of the concerns of this effort in terms of container identity is that what we've found for anything that requires API server modifications or anything that can't be run against what we call like a vanilla Kubernetes cluster is pretty impossible for other technologies to adopt. Or let me put this that way: we actually had conversations with Deis prior to when they were sort of developing a lot of this, and flat out told us that they couldn't use our OpenID Connect solution because it requires API server modifications. Lots of people really enjoy only running against any Kubernetes cluster you can drop them on. So basically things like the dashboard and Helm and Tiller don't have, my hypothesis for why they don't have good solutions is because there's nothing built into core Kubernetes, and the extension mechanisms are high enough overhead that people who want to be able to run on every Kubernetes clusters just don't depend on something that requires you to reconfigure your kubelet or reconfigure your API server or deploy even your components with some cloud integrations from the start. So I think that the sort of impact on container identity, in my opinion, is that it would be extremely helpful if, while we are exploring lots of different flex volumes for different auth providers or secret providers like Vault, it'd be very helpful to have sort of one generic and vanilla endorsed mechanism for what the service account v2 looks like. That way, if you look at sort of what the Vault providers did, the solution that is being proposed by Vault about having a Kubernetes auth backend works against any generic Kubernetes cluster. And I think that that's a strong reason and a good argument for solutions like that. So it would be helpful if, while we are exploring this, we had sort of maybe endorsed one particular mechanism of service account credentials that maybe worked with the TLS bootstrapping stuff, and allowed external applications that are going to run against a quote-unquote vanilla Kubernetes cluster to work relatively well, or to be able to assume that capability is available to them.
I think right. So if you have your cluster and you have an OIDC backend, it's easy enough to point other things at that OIDC provider. I think Mike's proposal solves this one way, and I haven't read it in detail recently. Another kind of like straw man proposal I was going to throw out is adding an endpoint to the Kubernetes API that's an OIDC identity provider that just issues an OIDC identity that represents whatever identity that you've authenticated to Kubernetes with.
I don't think we want to bake that into the provider or bake that into the server itself. I think if we did something along those lines, it would be more like letting discovery information be published, so that like one of the well-known OpenID configuration types of discovery docs could be served from the API server, and so you could reference like a OIDC server that you would run separately. I would rather build on like discovery mechanisms than trying to pull things into core.
But
the case that doesn't cover though is if you have some cluster users that authenticate with like a certificate, right? And they don't necessarily have an identity in an OpenID provider.
But they could exchange a certificate for an identity potentially. So maybe like an option might be, and like I'm just spitballing here, but like if there's an easy to run, simple like OAuth or OIDC bridge that you could run on any kube cluster, and you just like to the well-known discovery, like most clusters probably are going to have some identity in discovery. Say we went a little bit further, we could say, okay, well, not only can you easily add discovery info by mutating kube public or something like that, but you can easily run like a simple shim OIDC provider potentially. And like we haven't really talked about auth extension. It's like we have the code level auth extension and we have OIDC, which is effectively, but we've never really gone and said, is that a sufficient extension model? And maybe that's a SIG-auth topic that we should like push on really soon.
Yeah, I think this whole thing is maybe a little more of a SIG-auth topic than here. I think the overlap is like Mike's proposal for verifiable JOTs, where maybe there's.
And I think Mike's proposal, like there is some like, and this is tough too. Like I have a bias here, which is like the thing I want at my heart is to make it so darn easy to do security correctly that we stop screwing this up. Like the history of computing is very hard computing solutions that are very complex that nobody figures out how to do because you have to do work to get them. And so like trying to get to like the service account token was I don't know if I'm going to say misguided, but it was an earnest attempt to start down that path outside of like the companies that can dictate this top to bottom. If we can find the right glue point here, like like if we can do that, we could like to get apps to the point where they have an identity ejected that you can use to assert could be just as relevant as you can then go take that identity and exchange it for an OIDC token safely. I don't know, like there's a certain amount of spitballing around this, but like I would absolutely agree with the intent though that native kube clusters can securely do this sort of thing, regardless of what extensions to kube you have installed, or that the series of steps to get those extensions installed is really easy.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that whatever like kind of API guarantees or the externalized surface area is both minimal and as standards oriented as possible, so that you could easily discover it, and other types of auth integrations wouldn't have to write to Kubernetes as much as like write to OpenID, or if there are similar types of discovery mechanisms for cert-based auth. I just, whatever the backing implementation is, keeping the external part minimal and discoverable.
So the next thing is why don't we literally just give, as an analogy to the service account, each pod a key pair, and if we want to bridge to something, you have a bridge service. That's what Vault does. That's what we're suggesting for OIDC. Then we can like get that into core, and everything else, all the FlexVolume stuff, if you want to do daemon sets, whatever approach you want to use, can be done outside of core. And I guess I'm wondering like what the downside or what the limitation or what use case is not addressed by that.
So I mean, that's what the SIG is. I think that's what the working group is trying to discuss here, which is it's not going to go into core straight away because that's not how we do things in Kube anymore.
Well, I mean, I guess my question is, what is the problem with just extending the service account mechanism to additionally give a per pod signed key pair, which can then be used to exchange, and then all the other use cases are out of core, right?
Well, but that first one is that the sufficient and right model, which is, and Mike's proposal goes into some of the deeper details. I think like the Spiffy work and the and some of the other discussions that have been going around Istio is like it may be that simple, and I think the due diligence on the working group is we have to prove that it's going to work and that it's going to satisfy enough use cases and enough participants that we don't rush into it, and we can't rush into it in core anyway. And so the part of the discussion about extension is someone should be able to prove that this works or not. People should be able to get experience with it. And I would like to see people, like I think it would be a great thing if in 1.8, 1.9, and 1.10, people are able to do a really simple proof of concept, like push button get private keys injected into every pod. Some of the bigger concerns are we want to go do the other parts that I think Mike's document goes very deep on this topic, but there's a huge set of trade-offs that are very, very scary when you start talking about the difference between like simple kube clusters and like infrastructure scale kube clusters. And I think like we probably want to take that simple idea. Like I think that's kind of what we're all dancing around is like, here's the simple idea. Can we convince ourselves that we've thought enough about it that it would be the right thing? I don't think that we had talked about this. Greg and I had had a quick conversation just about, we want to try to start moving the SIG into or the working group into a setup, maybe like people can do concrete prototypes of a couple of these ideas in a couple of different directions, like the FlexVolume work, an integration with like Kerberos or somebody could go do that, injecting a private key, doing a node level private key, turning service account tokens into something that's done on the node rather than on the API server, like a couple of those basically, and try to say, okay, we'll go do these prototypes, come back, and then present those. People in the community can try it. We can get some real feedback there.
I mean, as well as forks, that we do have experimental and alpha mechanisms, right? It's not like the only mechanism is to build it in an extendable way. We have a lot of precedent of doing things and removing them.
Yeah.
This is what Istio is doing today. Istio auth CA sort of is a prototype of this idea. It goes and injects a key pair into every pod.
Yeah, I think so. Justin, I'd say I think from what I've seen of what people's concerns are, that it would be the wrong thing to try to push something to alpha. It would be better to do the broader kind of gather, like to do several of these sorts of things as this working group is for the people who are all impacted by it. I think the trade-off is finding the balance between moving something forward. I don't think there's a desire to, or I've heard it voiced to me a lot of concerns about rushing too fast on this, on anything that is perceived as Kubernetes core, because there are legitimately many different ways to approach this. And I think more than any other extension effort in Kube, this has all sorts of sensitive like things. There's like the simple, I want to run apps on Kube in the cloud. And then there's, I want to integrate this with my LDAP identity system on the back end. The two worldviews aren't that far apart. I was kind of hoping the working group could bring all of the topics, and then everybody, enough participants can say, yep, we all agree that there should be something in Kube core because we've proven it works, et cetera. We've thought through the outcomes, and we think everybody can get behind this. So basically, yes, but it's like the process of it.
Yeah, I guess I just say that, like, listening to all these use cases, we will talk about the use cases and enumerate them for, the next 5 releases. I guess the question is, like, is there a use case out there for which the minimal thing, like, is there anything left to take away if we just give everything a key pair? And is there any use case which is not covered by that and the Vault style bridge, or a Vault style or an OIDC bridge, or whatever it is?
I think technically that kind of bridge approach works just fine, but from a convenience point, it's kind of painful because every app at the app layer then, or with a sidecar or something, you have to go talk to the bridge and do that exchange.
OIDC is also just not a general enough spec to satisfy a lot of use cases too. Just FYI.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of the cert, adding a key pair, a certificate, and a key pair to the Surface account. Lets you. I think that is general enough to support all the kind of bridges. Doesn't mean the bridges would be easy to write, because you'd still have to, from that bridge, you have to go back and introspect to find out whether that pod satisfies your auth policy for however you're mapping to the external identity.
As soon as you start doing key pairs, then you're talking about, like, well, what's the lifetime of the key pair, and do you expire it or rotate it or renew it or maintain it, or like it? Yes, it is conceptually simple, but like, do you tie things to the lifetime of the pod, or do you terminate the pod when the thing expires? In practice, you immediately get like 100 follow-up questions.
We do, Jordan, but I mean, I think like what you said about it being standards-based, it is the one where we know a lot of those questions. Like we can give the first 50 questions right away, right? We don't necessarily have answers, but we know what those questions are. Whereas like with JWT, we don't have those. We don't have those first 50 questions. And
I think we do. I think we have. So maybe what I would say, Justin, is I think most people on this probably agree. And what we're really talking about is how do we make this a inclusive? How do we do the due diligence, ask the right questions, build a set of prototypes, encourage people to practically use them, which, like, I think to your point about alpha, like, I would prefer somebody goes and does a couple of simple ones of these, like Istio and something else alongside that people try and use. We can do that without changing core. Like, we could today go add a controller that generates certs and sticks them onto service account tokens, right? So, like, I think, like, and that's the thing is, like, we're so close to it. I think we know the 50 questions. I think we'd want to make sure we're asking the top level question of, are we looking at all the technologies appropriately? Do we have the list of 50 questions for the things we're most comfortable with? Do we get the questions and then get some answers for the ones that we're not as comfortable with? And then do we make the trade-offs clear to everybody on this working group and then report that and then get experimentation with apps? Like those kind of like that arc, I think is what we're on. So Justin, I also feel your I don't want to say impatience, enthusiasm.
Enthusiasm is the yes.
Because I actually, like, OpenShift has had one for serving certs that generates a serving cert for a service. And like you say, like put an annotation on service, you get a TLS certificate signed for the DNS name from the cluster. Like it's a transformative thing when you can rely on that. And I want us to get some of these transformative things through Istio and through all the projects, like as this like push button, get real security on clusters. So, and that's kind of where the prototype might come in. It's like, let's get some of those prototypes identified and then have some folks bang some out.
So we're basically out of time. Mike's doc got a few mentions. I think I'm going to try and hopefully it works with his schedule to get him on to talk through that doc for the next meeting. Is there anything else that people think we should have on the agenda for the next meeting?
Maybe we want to talk about some concrete prototypes, like and start assembling here's what container identity is suggesting for prototypes and existing solutions in this space, and start pushing some concrete ideas.
Does everybody here already know what Istio have been doing in the space? Because maybe we could talk through that as a first concrete one.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Tal's right here. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to us about what they're doing.
Sure.
Yeah.
We can talk about that.
And maybe tie that into some of the things coming in 1.8 that can improve that, like initializers and being able to mutate pods externally on the way in. So some of that will land in 1.8 and help.
Yep. Okay. All right. That sounds like an agenda. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.